Both conventions are usually a little bit later than these conventions are this year. And the Democrats is, of course, in August in Chicago, and that's going to be an explosion of violence. I mean, just look at these campouts all the terrorists are having on college campuses. They're going to be camping out in Chicago.
You're dealing with two cities, right?
Yeah.
Milwaukee and Chicago. And the mayors are like, oh no, we love the violence.
Yeah. I mean, that's
the violence elected us.
It's just wild.
I was afraid of democratic violence. And I still am.
Yeah.
You had good reason to, dude. We lived
through
some of the fucking riots. We
lit-
lived in Washington,
they
D.C.
lit fires after
We had to go to our office and empty all the files out because they were burning cop cars in front of our office every night on national television.
I think Trump wins, we're going to see that on a whole other level. Because
you're right.
the way that the left has primed their supporters, well, if they're like, I'm fighting Nazis, I'm like the French resistance, you know? What are they not willing to do?
Are you telling me that the like people who do the gays for Gaza thing don't have the critical thinking skills to totally process what exactly people are?
A new study reports that credit card rewards provide a lifeline for working class Americans. Rewards like cash back empower low and middle income families to pay for the rising price of groceries and gas. So why are DC politicians partnering with corporate megastores to steal cash back from families during skyrocketing inflation? The Durbin-Marshall credit card bill takes billions from American families lining corporate pockets instead. Protect our credit card rewards lifeline. Tell DC politicians to oppose the Durbin-Marshall credit card bill. Learn more at electronicpayments.coalition.org.
Ladies and gentlemen, your attention, please.
Just a catching strays over here.
You're in for a hell of a show.
Keep the faith, hold the line, and own the libs.
It's time for our main event.
Well, this is a special little Ruthless program gathering.
Right? Very charming location.
Yeah,
For today's episode, where are we?
My home. I'm the founder of the feast.
King of the castle.
King of the castle. Welcome to my home.
Well, I mean,
The
we're
old
here in large part because of the Torch guys who are sponsoring this episode, and they've done something very lovely for you, Michael.
Yes, this is the Breckenridge fire pit table. I had a fire pit here before, but I got young kids.
Yes.
Okay, and it was a fine fire pit table, but it had that sort of like shaved like pieces of glass.
Oh, so they picked it up.
Picked it up constantly,
Yeah.
playing with it, trying to put it in their mouths, trying to throw it around, trying to hit each other with it.
What is it with kids that they just have to try
I
to
don't
kill
know. It's
themselves?
shiny, and it
Yeah.
looks dangerous, and so kids play with that sort of stuff. But I love this thing. So I mean, shout out to Torch guys.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's great. Like the surface is great. It's easy to clean, and also it has this great protector here of glass. So like when it's windy, the flame doesn't die. The kids can't get in there. So I love the thing.
Must not have been much to install it, because I mean, like all of a sudden you show up one day, it's here.
Yeah, I mean they did it like that.
Huh.
Guys came in, you put in a propane tank.
Okay, that's what I was wondering. It goes right.
Yeah.
It's right underneath.
Yeah, and then you just turn this key on the other side and you light it, and you can control the height and how much flame and stuff. It's really straightforward.
Lovely little porch.
Yeah.
And we like an outdoor gathering.
It's ambiance.
It is.
And we're at the variety program, we're all about ambiance
We love ambiance.
because the sage is everything.
Stage is everything, which is why you're going to be happy to know that we have special episodes planned where we're going to come in and change out your sinks.
No.
We're going to redo your
We got
flooring.
spaghetti on the
No.
horn with every single appliance group in the region, and we're just going to start in your kitchen and move around, just
Yeah.
kind of fuck stuff up on the regular.
It's
Is
going
that
to be
good?
like, what's that show?
Extreme Home
where
Makeover Duncan Edition.
They move the truck, and
Yeah.
they're like, move that truck.
Yeah.
We're back at Duncan's house, fucking up his life and making his wife want to divorce him.
Everything's falling apart.
Except we never finished the
No,
project.
nothing gets finished. We get 3/4 of the way through, and then we cut the episode.
Okay, we got what we need, fellas.
Yeah.
It'd be a pretty good goof on the old man.
Oh, man. So you'll hear more about Torch guys later in the episode. But, fellas, look, it's a nice time when you're having a bourbon, you're hanging out with your buddies. Beautiful night, nice fire. Just got to talk about the state of the world and where we're at. Maybe start with some politics. What do we think? We're in the end of May.
Yeah. I think we were talking about this the other week, that I was bringing up that it feels like folks are starting to tune in sooner to politics. Like, it used to be the rule of thumb that, like, well, voters aren't paying any attention during the summer. you have to wait until fall, kids get back to school, then folks start paying attention. I think that time has passed. Now it's just 24/7 with the news cycle. Folks are completely tuned in already to this election.
Well, I think especially because we already know the candidates.
Yeah.
We've known them forever.
Yeah.
100% name ID. You know, we're running it back. We're running the election back, right? So, like,
Yeah.
it kind of is what it is. And I think that contributes to it. Then also, it's just like everybody's plugged in.
And the debate is, this has to be the soonest there's ever been a presidential debate in June.
For sure.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
That's unreal.
They
I actually
shattered
really
the old
like
debate
it.
commission.
Yeah, finally. I actually really like that they're doing it in June.
Yeah.
Well, get it out of the way. What are we waiting for
Yeah.
October or something?
Well,
like
that's
that?
the thing, Ashbrook.
Let's do it.
You said the other episode that you thought, and I agree, I completely buy into this theory, that the Biden campaign pushed to have it in June because they're like, if it ends up being an absolute disaster, they can just yank him out and go
Exactly.
for like a replacement. You'll have enough time.
Exactly.
Because I can't think of any other reason. You know, I think it's got to be like September's the earliest I can remember a presidential
And the
Yeah,
late
no, I
debate
think
happening.
that's right. Because both conventions are usually a little bit later than these conventions are this year. And the Democrats is, of course, in August in Chicago, and that's going to be an explosion
Just a
of
mess.
violence. I mean, just look at these campouts all the terrorists are having on college campuses. They're going to be camping out in Chicago.
Well,
Yeah.
here's the best part about the convention situation with the violence or potential for violence is there's like this inherent tension between the staff of the RNC and the DNC and the Secret Service, which is charged with kind of like protecting the envelope of security there, and then the local mayors, which you're dealing with two cities, right?
Yeah.
Milwaukee and Chicago, and the mayors are like, oh no, we love the violence.
Yeah, I mean that's
The violence elected us.
It's just wild.
I mean, that's the thing is like, so Chicago somehow got like an even worse mayor who's now, I think he said he was just like a straight up communist.
Yeah.
And they basically have to live with their voters 365 days a year. Like the convention can be for a week and you can complain that, oh, the crime is terrible for a week. But if they do anything in these cities to try and fight crime, they're getting voted out.
Totally.
So they
Yeah.
have to be like, no, you're on your own. I prefer staying indoors. It works for me. Maybe you guys give that a shot.
It's a wild thing.
Yeah.
There's like no compromise. They're like, no, violence is for us. That's who we are,
Right.
and you've come to visit, so violence is bestowed upon you as well.
Well, yeah, you were telling me there's some story in Milwaukee about how
Yeah.
originally the mayor said that he's only going to extend security to like half a block away
Yes.
from the entrance.
Well, they had a protest zone that was across the street from the convention where the people going into the convention would actually have to like walk through it.
so like within Molotov range.
Well,
is what
for
they're
sure.
really
For sure.
aiming for.
What people don't realize is that in Chicago, there's a rule that once a week, every pizza place is supposed to empty their cash register into a criminal's pocket.
Yeah.
And all the vendors coming in for the convention, they're for a rude awakening. You set up a Subway, every foot long you sell, gone.
More or less an offering plate at the top of the subway.
Exactly, you're tithing to the criminals. You have to do it. Just the way it goes in Chicago.
But what do you think happens? I mean, look, we've had trials, we've had, Biden stuff. The episode that we did back in May where we just played nothing but Biden clips was just hilarious. Because you can't go through a week
Yeah.
with this guy without just butchering the English language. I don't think anybody actually thinks he's fit to do the job. But all of this has contributed to sort of like a Trump lead, but it's a small one in a lot of these states.
Well, that's the thing is, I said, I think on the previous episode that originally I thought it was like a conspiracy theory, the whole thing of like they're going to place Biden. Ashbrook's been on board with this idea since like day one. I have finally come around to thinking that's a real possibility because it has gotten that bad. When he's having, events where he was like, well, I brought home a hostage and he's here today. Oh, wait, correction. He has remained a hostage as we speak.
Right.
He is not back yet. Like, that's a bit more than just like, mixing up names or something like that.
Yep.
And that, him being old has become so ingrained in the minds of voters. It's not like, there's like 4 other things they know about this guy, and then they're like, oh, also he's kind of old. That's like the first thing anyone says about Biden. Like, you look at any focus groups, what do you think? What are 3 words you'd use to describe Biden? Number 1 is old in every single time. So that is really hurting their chances. And Kamala's just like, hey guys.
Yeah, everybody's like,
yeah,
Dumb.
Get back
Old and
in
dumb.
there.
I think the only reason why it's still Biden is because it's still Trump. It's as simple as that. Like if Donald Trump wasn't still on the scene,
They
would
have to
kick this guy to the curb a long time
They
ago.
would have to.
Like the only bet in Biden camp is the argument that, well, I beat him before.
Yeah.
You know, fuck the polls. Polls don't matter. I did it. How
Yeah.
can you? You got to dance with the one who brought you, as
Yeah.
they say.
Oh, it's
and
true.
so, like, that's their
But do
argument.
you think they even bought it? I mean, so part of his pitch, he didn't commit to only one term in 2020, but he kind of hinted at it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
It felt like it. It felt like he was saying
He was like saying to people, he's like, oh, COVID, all this chaos, everything, riots in the streets. Like, just put me in charge for a little bit. I'll settle things down. We'll do adult stuff. And like within, that had like a 15-second expiration date of his inauguration, and everything goes off the left-hand side of the map. All of a sudden, he ages 77 years in like the first 6 seconds of his presidency. He can't talk. He can't justify anything. Our world falls apart. And like, I just feel like nobody really suspected on the Democrat side that this guy was going to be like, yep, I'm running it up again.
Yeah, it kind of did feel kind of like an unspoken promise. Like even the kind of things that the campaign was putting out, they're like, oh, you know, let's get the adults back in charge. The caretaker theme of like,
Right.
oh, you know, we're just here to make sure the trains run on time. You
Yeah.
know, we it was like a wink and a nudge of like, you know, we're not trying to just have some sort of a mandate
Yeah.
to rule here. We're not going to make a bunch of new laws or anything. It's just going to be us, you know, to get things back to normal. And the old man's going
Because
to
he
like
could get the
walk off into
progressives
sunset.
on board with that just because it's not Trump.
Yep.
Right? And they're like, okay, fine. We'll take a pause if it means we don't get this guy. And like the old establishment part of the Democratic Party is fine with that. And we're all on the team to try to get Trump out of there.
Yep. It
But
felt
like,
that was the deal.
but like a big part of the fact that I think he can't reunify the base, you know, there are issues like Israel and other things that have been going on that complicate it. But I think really the progressives are like, no, wait, we thought that this was a temporary thing.
Yeah.
We didn't know we had to follow an 85-year-old white guy around for the next 4 years. Right?
Well, I mean, if you think about who could replace him, like Elizabeth Warren, for example. Elizabeth Warren has nothing to complain about with his administration.
No.
He opened the borders, shut down energy production, and basically ruined our country in 4 years. He did exactly what Elizabeth Warren would have done.
He's having taxpayers
And so-
pay for student loans,
I was just gonna
even though the
say.
Supreme Court said that's illegal. He keeps up with that.
Right,
What's up with that, by
This
the
is
way?
the Elizabeth Warren presidency.
What? I thought we just firmly established that this was an illegal action, and they're like, yeah, here we go again. They've done it like 2-3 more times.
And that's exactly it. It is
don't
an
care.
illegal action. They don't care. They absolutely do not care.
How is there no recourse on any of this?
Well, that's the thing is, it's okay. It's when the Democrats do it. Like the example after example of how during the Trump administration, they impeached the guy. They're like, oh, we need to have norms. We need to bring back the norms, the rule of law. We're fighting to save democracy. That's all out the window. They're like, well, we're in charge here, so we're going to do whatever the hell we want.
Foreign influence over our elections.
Yeah,
And
completely.
they've got billionaires. Foreign
from
billionaires
Switzerland.
funding everything.
Hey folks, my friends at Americans for Prosperity are again on the front lines fighting against the border crisis. It's clear the politicians aren't going to solve this on their own. It's going to take good old-fashioned grassroots activism, and that's what AFP specializes in. Americans for Prosperity Foundation has taken hundreds of concerned citizens to see the border for themselves, turning them into informed activists. And Americans for Prosperity knows just what we need: more border agents, more walls, and more technology. That's what makes Americans for Prosperity unique. They do the tough work of organizing and mobilizing everyday Americans to make a difference. In fact, they just announced a major campaign to hold Biden and his allies accountable for the crisis at the border. Learn more at securebordersecureamerica.com. That's securebordersecureamerica.com.
Okay, so I want to ask a two-part question here.
Okay.
Okay, so we'll do part one first.
This seems well thought through.
Yeah,
man.
I'm thinking through
Conjuring.
it here. I'm conjuring. Okay, so part one. Democrats, lose in November. Joe Biden is the nominee, and he goes down in flames as
Yeah.
the guy who refused to give up the wheel of power, as so many boomers do.
Oh my gosh.
And when they're past their prime and try to hold on to the political power they've had since 1992. But he goes down in flames. What does that mean for the future of, Democratic Party and the progressive movement. Like what do you think happens post-November in that situation?
Well, to be honest with you, I mean, this is one of the things I caught a lot of heat for in the end of the 2020 election is like I was afraid of democratic violence. And I still am.
Yeah.
You had good reason to, dude. We lived
through
through the fucking riots. We lived in Washington, D.C.
They lit fires after.
We had to go to our office and empty all the files out because they were burning cop cars in front of our office every night on national television.
And how did the press write it?
Wasn't that a surreal thing, by the way, looking at your office and then like a cop car
Fucking
on fire
surreal.
in front of
Fucking surreal.
Yeah.
And you know what was even more surreal was the run-up to the election, months later. A lot of those riots were like May, June, July. But then come like the last week of October, I don't know if you guys remember this.
Yeah.
They started boarding up the windows of every bar, every restaurant, every first floor in like a 4-block radius of the White House, downtown Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, like where the people of the world, the tourists come and visit.
Right.
I mean, what an incredible sign of like the distress in our country. But they weren't putting up those boards in case, Donald Trump lost.
Right.
They
right.
weren't putting them up for
I forgot
January
about this.
6th. They were putting them up if Donald Trump won.
That's exactly right.
And that's the thing is, I think Trump wins, we're going to see that on a whole other level. Because
you're right.
the way that the left has primed their supporters of, oh, well, Trump and his supporters are Nazis. They're like, we're fighting fascism. If he wins, it's fascism. It's all over.
Yeah.
And so if you put this idea in people's heads over and over and over and over again, well, if they're like, I'm fighting Nazis, I'm like the French Resistance, what are they not willing to do?
Are you telling me that the like people who do the gays for Gaza thing don't have the critical thinking skills to totally process what exactly people are?
And beyond that, they've been primed to violence. They're being told that like your opponents are Nazis.
Entirely irrational lunatics, and it's the reason why many late nights I peruse on Zillow on my phone and look at property in like West Virginia.
Well, you're sort of our resident prepper anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like, I definitely looked at a lot of property, existing structures, and just lot and land.
Yeah, sure.
The important thing there is, like, limiting the points of egress and entry.
Of course, limiting. And Lee would tell you to watch out for the ridge line. You don't want to be on the ridge line. You just want to be just
Wolf's
below.
got some tips you should probably write down on all of that.
No, we've actually had in-depth discussions of this. So I've got a seasoned expert who did multiple tours in Afghanistan advising me on my bunker. So I feel very confident of all of that. But I can tell you one thing without a shadow of a doubt is I will not be anywhere near Washington, D.C. on Election Day.
I mean, how terrible is that? That's sad.
Yeah.
That is genuinely sad. We now accept that, listen, if Democrats don't get their way, there's going to be a summer of riots. People are going to die. You had a cop burned alive in the summer of these riots.
I know.
Yeah. Not only are they crazy, they're paid.
Yeah.
So they are financially incentivized to ruin our country, and not a single mainstream outlet is interested in like trying to follow the dime to figure out where it's coming from and how to stop it. They just
No, because they're on the
aren't
same
interested
team.
in doing it.
In some funny news, Media Matters for America had very severe layoffs.
Yeah, do you think the people who listen to our show got laid off?
That's the thing is I think we've lost probably about 5 listeners because Media Matters had these like layoffs for
it's a shame.
for the people.
Fuck yeah.
And
I'm so glad they lost their jobs.
it was hilarious, and so they were like
World-class terrible people.
truly the worst people.
Yeah.
They're absolute monsters, goblin people. But this one of them sends out this tweet of being like, "Oh, this is some sad news. Media Matters had some layoffs because she refused to say it by name. She was like, Elon Musk is suing them for like lying about him and all this shit." And so they were like, "Well, time to fire these idiots."
He's doing the full Deadspin thing on them.
Well, that's the thing is, so like they have Media Matters beyond what you just see in public. Behind the scenes, they engage in like just blackmail, extortion. They try to find dirt on people and ruin their lives.
No, seriously. So explain this for people and like for our listeners who maybe know Media Matters is the people who tweet out clips of Tucker Carlson and stuff. That like it is a true iceberg. Like what you see publicly is just the very tip of their PR strategy. But behind the scenes, it's a total like intimidation and blackmail.
Yeah.
Like both to individuals and people, and then also to advertisers. And the entire thing is they want to find a choke point where they can cut off money to independent media, to conservative media, people like us.
Or anybody in a professional or political standing that is right of center.
Yes.
That it's a threat.
Yeah, well, the advertiser
Go
thing
hard.
is a great way to start with, where
Yes.
any conservative outlet, any center outlet, honestly, they push these campaigns against their advertisers to be like, hey, you have to stop advertising on Fox News. You have to stop advertising with the Daily Wire. Or, we're going to tell everybody that you're a bunch of fascists and you're a bunch of racists, and we're going to tell people to stop shopping at your stores.
And it sounds ridiculous, but they have success.
They've had tremendous success in this, right?
Yeah.
And because they want to choke money off from any media source.
So can I
that
stop you
disagree
right
with
there? Because they've now actually they've taken this whole plan to a different level. So they did that with television and everything, and in the same way that they have infused like DEI into corporate America, they've now infused this same thing into the largest holding companies that do advertising in this country, online advertising in particular. And there are these new like accreditation services, right?
Yep.
That are like, they talk to like the largest like P&G, like the largest advertisers who sell like household products. Like they spend hundreds of millions of dollars on the internet every year trying to get people to buy their deodorant and soap and shit like that. Well, they go to all of the advertising firms that rep these Fortune 50 companies, and they say, well, all of your advertising should be through our accredited service that makes sure that you end up on brand safe websites.
Yes.
Right?
And brand safe is always left of center, progressive, left
correct
stuff.
Right. So they've got these activist groups that create block lists of places like Breitbart, right? Or Fox News, or like our podcast.
Yeah.
And they put them on these lists, so then those people can go back to their C-suite and be like, we only run brand-safe advertising. But the dirty little secret is what they're doing is choking off the money to independent media. Has nothing to do with being brand-safe at all.
It's a criminal act.
Yeah.
It really is.
Right.
Good God.
And they've even extended this now to donors, where if they find out someone has been donating, like a major donor to the Republican Party, for example, they try to hunt them down. They go try to talk to their friends and be like, hey, we're offering you some money if you could give us some, something embarrassing about this person. And it's just a despicable
it's ridiculous
enterprise. And for them to not only be like, oh, we were fighting for democracy and everything, but to get back to the original point I made of why the media doesn't call them out on this is, so this girl's like, oh, I got laid off today. There were people from the Washington Post replying, being like, I'm dead serious, from the Washington Post being like, ugh, this is absolutely terrible. I'm so sorry. I
The
swear
Washington Post on
Washington
media,
Post.
this tells you everything you need to know.
Exactly.
Everything you need to know.
Can you believe that?
No, it's despicable.
That's how bad it's gotten.
I can't
Well, that's
believe
their
it.
farm system.
You're talking about the iceberg, which I think you were referring to their intentions and everything they were doing. One of the other aspects of the iceberg that I think fits here is the behind-the-scenes relationships and conversations that are ongoing between major media outlets and organizations like Media Matters.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, if you think that news stories are shaped entirely by the reporters who are out there working their ass off
Just
to
being
try to tell both
entrepreneurial.
sides.
Yeah, right. They're getting it fed.
How else do you explain, for example, how every cycle the top 3 Republican Senate recruits are immediately of interest with all of their opposition research available to the New York Times, Washington Post.
The night after their primary victory.
Every single year. And the funny thing is, it's like if you do this, if you've been in the game for a little while, like the day after the primary that all of these things are coming.
Yeah.
But yet they're shameless about it, right? There's never a profile of like Dave McCormick in Pennsylvania. Like they're not trying to introduce you to a guy with a legitimately incredible life story.
Right.
What they're trying to do is say, well, what's his political competitive advantage? Well, it's the fact that he's running against a Nepo baby who's been in the Senate for God knows how long, exclusively because his father was a political figure in Democratic politics dating back to the 60s. all right, so we got to kind of show that he's not like a newcomer.
Yeah.
And so they start writing this whole story about how he's like, his dad was politically connected.
Yeah.
And it was like the most ridiculous claim. You read through it and it's like, what the heck are you talking about?
Because he worked at like a local small college in like the middle of Pennsylvania. The guy's wired up with
so
the highest levels of power.
Oh.
They're no longer interested in objectivity. They write about this. They say that out loud, that journalism is not about objectivity. I don't know if you guys have followed some of these stories.
Oh, yeah.
Columbia School of Journalism, Columbia, the famous place where all the terrorists were camping.
Yeah.
Columbia School of Journalism had like an article that was like, is objectivity even possible in journalism?
I mean,
and it's just like, they say that because
think about that.
They care more about.
What a disgusting.
They care more about their political party than they do about their audience.
Yeah.
So I want to wrap this back to your original question about what happens to the Democratic Party, because I think it's a real mess. Everybody talks about the Republican Party exclusively because Trump sort of broke the system, and he did. There's no question about that. Whatever, there was sort of a hierarchical lens to presidential candidates in Republican politics dating back to Reagan. And beyond that, Nixon, Eisenhower, we can keep going back. But the Democratic side to me, is sort of like one of those duck on the pond type situations where they look like they're just sort of gliding on top, and then underneath is just furious activity.
Yeah.
When this guy's gone, it is going to be an absolute disaster.
That's the thing is, that's one hiccup I see in the whole thing of if they get rid of Biden. Because I think Kamala would expect, and if you're vice president, I think you'd expect that, okay, well, I guess that means I'm up. Voters clearly, when she in the Democratic primary couldn't even make it to Iowa, voters absolutely are not with that.
Well, and she's the only one with a lower approval rating than Biden himself.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
And then you've got Mayor Pete, who's been waiting in the wings. He's been waiting for this day to try and jump in.
Yeah.
Elizabeth Warren, she's ready to go too. She's always thought that, she's being robbed of the opportunity. There's a Gavin Newsom who's been basically publicly interviewing for the job of president for the past year. It's going to be an absolute bloodbath.
And if you look at what they're up to, I think the biggest issue is less about the names as it is about what they're responsive to, including Joe Biden. Mm-hmm. And what they're responsive to is clinical insanity.
Yeah.
It's something that has a resonance of less than 15%. They took a poll of like what people think about the protesters and their message and all these college campuses about basically sticking up for Hamas. It was like 14%. 14%.
Right.
They all exclusively, though, come off the left-hand side, and they're a reliable voting bloc for them. Mm-hmm. And they've increasingly been responsive to that niche constituency where I think you can win primaries in Democratic politics nationally,
I think you
appealing
can
to them.
Yeah. I think you can, too. And if you look at Fetterman, if I don't know how closely you guys, I know you guys watched him closely and how he's operated over the last year and a half. Total shock to everybody that he has been the opposite of like the Tlaibs and the Omars and everything.
Well, he went into the hospital a progressive Democrat. He came out a conservative Republican.
Yeah,
this is the most damnedest thing I've ever seen in my life.
And it really makes you wonder, like Mayor Pete, Mr. Perfect, political, everything's perfect. Elizabeth Warren, everything is perfect. Like cookie cutter talking points that are written by 18 consultants. The Republican Party has long since rejected that form of politics.
Yeah, it's coming on the
and I think it's coming on their side too. Probably Obama is the one thing that can enforce party discipline because he's also Mr. Engineered talking point as well. But I think it's coming on their side.
I think it is too. But if you flip this around and you also look at the Republican side, either way you look at it, 2024 is going to be the last election of both Donald Trump and Joe Biden. So 2028, you're going to have something brand new.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to look at it through a Republican lens too, because you see, typically in Republican politics, up until Trump, what's happened is anybody who makes a strong showing in a primary in the previous election cycle kind of gets another run at it, right? You think of Mitt Romney in 2012, or W had a different thing because of his dad, but his dad did it in '76 and then came back after the Reagan presidency. Reagan himself did it.
Right.
Right? Nixon did it.
Right.
So, there is an element there where you could string between that and look at somebody like a DeSantis or a Nikki Haley.
Well, yeah, so that's the second part of my question, right? Like, we talked about the Democrats, but like, if somehow they, Biden cobbles back together the coalition and wins, if Donald Trump loses, what does that mean for the future of the Republican Party?
Yeah.
What does that mean for the future of the conservative movement?
Well, DeSantis, he's term limited, right?
Yes.
In Florida, and,
Yep.
and that's what, in 2026?
It would have been, so he won in 22. Yes, 2026. Yeah.
I mean, so that's tough. Whenever you've got time in between being in office
It is really tough.
to running for president.
I told everyone who was thinking, it was one of my pitches for people to run for Senate.
Yeah.
Was
It's a
like,
good one.
listen, man, there's not a lot of people who can just get out of the public eye altogether, have no, sort of pitch to media organizations where they should have you on.
Yeah.
Like, just going flat-footed and starting an organization and trying to run for president is really tough unless you have, like, ubiquitous name ID like Donald Trump.
Yeah.
So you're right. I mean, somebody who's out of office for 2 years, it makes it more difficult. Now, he did run and become a nationwide known Republican. That came with good and bad, right? I mean, people had opinions about that, both sides. But I think he's still going to be a force in Republican politics, no matter what, don't you?
Well, I mean, his record, that's the thing is, whenever I talk to friends who live in Florida, they're just
Oh,
like,
they love
they're
him.
ride or die
Yeah.
for DeSantis, and for good reason.
Yeah, but what does that mean for the Trump coalition? Is that actually something that's transitive to other people? I think there's a lot of evidence it's not.
I think the Trump coalition is very difficult to keep together.
Without the right person.
Well, I think whatever comes next is going to look different, and that's not to say that the America First movement isn't incredibly powerful. I think it's the most powerful thing in Republican politics that we've seen in my lifetime, in a lot of ways. But they're also identifiable with an individual, and like the point I always used to make in the primary is like nobody runs and wins on somebody else's political movement. It just doesn't work that way.
Right.
Like, you just see it as inauthentic,
Right.
and it's just kind of hijacking what's already there.
Right.
It's like if you look at a poll and you're like, well, here's 52% of the people, I'm that. People just see through that shit right away.
I think in terms of like policy, though, the Trump presidency is going to have a lasting impact. I think for the better. I think the days of, having a Republican run on, okay, we need tax cuts,
Right.
corporations or people, those days are over. I mean, it's become clear that every corporation hates us and wants us dead, right? They're not on our side in the least, and it's become incredibly clear the way that they fund the left, and that every left-wing policy they adopt, and even the media companies will push out. I mean, look what's done to Disney stock, but hey, they'll stick with it.
Well, I don't disagree with you that I think Donald Trump permanently changed Republican politics, but like one of the most successful things Donald Trump did when Donald Trump was president was a tax cut. Like, that is one of his signature accomplishments.
I mean, like,
you know what I mean?
I mean, like the whole like Romney Ryan of like, we're gonna cut corporate tax rates.
But that's what he did.
No, so what we saw as a result of that tax rate is that the people who benefited the most were the working class people. That's
Of
why you had
course.
the most upward mobility
It
among the
turns
working
out with
class.
tax cuts.
It turns out that's how it works.
That's how it works.
Yeah.
Here's the other thing that Trump has done so well that the next person, if they're going to succeed, they're going to have to do, and that's like sticking up for the little guy in the face of everything that is elite about Washington and about New York. So he constantly is positioning himself as fighting for the working man, the overlooked voter out there, and he's not seen as like playing the game to make himself look good for his own advantage at the expense of people who don't have a voice.
You're right, and I think it's a
somebody-
little different than, we always talk about it in terms of like blue collar or working man or something, in that. I think it's the culturally, people who are culturally like disenfranchised in some way by national conversation, and it's not really about demographics as much as it is about geographics. And if you're not a coastal elite, I don't care what your politics are. If you're in the center of this country, nobody gives a shit about you. Nobody they're talking about, trans bathrooms, and you're like, well, my paycheck is like $400 less than it was last month.
Yeah.
Right.
Like, why do I give a shit about that?
Right.
And plus, there's nobody in my town where this is an issue.
Right.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Right.
And like he speaks to this kind of thing, and he recognizes that kind of thing instinctively, which is good. And I think that part definitely transitions.
And he gets attacked by the press.
I
hold on though. Maybe it does. But like, all right, let me pose another question. Like, what is America first? Because I understand what Donald Trump did when Donald Trump was president, and I understand that is
There's a lot of people who want to define what it is.
America first. But if you actually like peeled back the onion, and again, we're talking about like in the unfortunate situation in which we do not win in November, right? Like, who's going to come up and like take the mantle of what this thing is that is America first? You have people who are like libertarian, anti-war folks. Who,
they say that's America first.
like they jumped to the front of the parade
Yeah.
and declared themselves the people who got Donald Trump elected.
Which like Soleimani would quibble with.
Then you've got folks. Then you have like people who are that, but like also like paleocon, like really hard on the border and trade, right?
Yeah.
And like a lot of those are obviously things that Donald Trump cares about, right?
That's the closest adhesion.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, and then you've got various aspects of both
Social conservatives.
and the Tea Party movement, and these are actual factions.
Yeah.
Like there is no cohesive ideology amongst all of these things, but they all, and this is part about being like the party in power, is like once you have the presidency, everybody sort of gets on the same song sheet, and they're like, we are this thing. But are we all this thing?
Yeah, no.
So,
like as a movement broadly, I would say.
So I would say the best comparison, policy-wise, of trying to explain what America First is Nixonian politics, almost to a T across the board. When it comes to foreign policy, madman theory, which was attributed to Nixon, of like world leaders were like, we don't know what this guy's going to do. Like famously on Christmas Day, he sent planes with nukes to circle around Vietnam. And he was like, you're going to come to the negotiating table. And then Kissinger was on the phone with the Vietnamese delegation in Paris, and he was like, this guy's crazy. I don't know what he's going to do. But they came to the table, right?
Yeah.
And in the same way, like the strike on Soleimani, the media, Democrats were like, this guy's going to start World War III. It ended their shit.
Yeah.
Iran was no longer an issue. In fact, they were broke. They didn't have the money to fund any of the things that they are now currently funding across the world with their
Because
proxies.
Biden gave their money back.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
I think that's true.
And then economically, Nixon's whole message was the silent majority, the forgotten man.
Yeah.
And those groups of people who that resonates with, who, like you said, they don't give a shit about this like left-wing bullshit social agenda. They're like, why is it that they're suffering right now through high inflation?
Nobody's talking about my stuff.
No one's talking about their stuff.
Yeah.
And so he spoke to the silent majority, because that is the majority of Americans who are like, listen, my focus is on trying to make sure my kids have it better than I had it, and that we're doing okay. I care about my household, number one. I don't
Right.
care about whatever is the next issue that's being put on, a piece of cardboard by some hippies, sitting in the middle of a bridge. That shit doesn't matter.
Okay, so but on the economic component of this, like, what is the America First agenda on economics? Because it seems like a very broad spectrum of people saying, I'm speaking for the silent majority or the working man.
I would say let Americans keep more of what they earn, level
Yeah.
the playing field overseas so that the Chinese aren't able to win
yeah,
the trade every day
well,
of the week.
I guess that's what I'm getting to. It's like, is it trade? I mean, we have Republicans who are doing
so
things like the PRO Act, right?
Yeah,
and like standing up for unions, and being like,
No, it's been perverted
so it's
a million
so
different
there's
times.
so I guess what I'm saying is like it is far like more of a spectrum than I think.
Way more.
That
You're right.
Than
You're
we
right.
acknowledge.
You're
right?
right.
Like it's
And
not
I-
that you're wrong. I
No,
think
but
you're right.
And I think
but,
it's a good thing.
Yeah.
I think that's the whole idea of being the Big Ten.
Well, that's how
Right.
you win.
Yeah,
Right?
that's how you win.
But I think, look, and I'm going to close it with this, is I learned from a bunch of really smart people early on in politics that your politics reflects the leadership of the moment, and quality leadership provides a different look at different issues, right? And Donald Trump has clearly changed things as Republicans look at things like trade, and Republicans look at, border policy and
Right.
things like that. And on the economic front, it's kind of a mixed bag of populism versus also he passed the biggest corporate tax cut in American history, right? So, but that's him. Whoever the next Republican is, you got to take like the center of conservative and what that means with limited government, a strong American presence, you know, whether that's military or whether that's your standing in the world. Like, it's up for people to define, but it will be defined. And Republicans were not going to nominate at any point anybody else who's going to try to hijack the exact same framework that Donald Trump has put together. Because like you just said, Michael, these people don't agree on things. What they can agree on is Donald Trump, and for a variety of different reasons. They love that he's breaking the system, or they love that he's creating all the right enemies, so to speak, you know? And he's kind of doing all of that, and that's great. But not two people can do it.
Because like he gets a hall pass on a lot of stuff that doesn't fit into their various parts of their personal platform.
Totally.
Right?
But he makes the right enemies.
He makes the right enemies.
Yeah.
And so like, I guess I would close it by saying we actually have it super easy right now.
Yeah.
Like as a movement, we have it super easy right now.
Yeah.
Because we have a standard bearer, and we're like, that's the guy.
Yep.
It gets a lot more difficult when he's no longer there.
No question about it. Well, thanks for joining us. This has been a fun little discussion.
Yeah.
We're going to keep it going. Michael, I'd like to give you all the credit in the world for having all of this ambiance, but it turns out the Torch guys are responsible for it.
They are. They came here. They installed this table. This is the Breckenridge fire pit. It's incredible. Obviously, the flame is great. It's great to have that protective glass. It's ambiance, right? Mm-hmm. It's it sort of like makes the whole evening when you're having a couple of pops with your pals.
Yeah.
I love it. And I also met the guys when they came here and installed it. Great friends of the program. Great
That's
guys.
Important.
It's fantastic, dude.
You know, it pumps out a little bit of warmth too, so I feel like this is going to be perfect during football season.
Oh,
Absolutely.
football season. My Lord, does that sound fantastic. Well, you remember, you can get, because you're a listener of the program, special pennies that come along with that. You get 15% off of everything with the code RUTHLESS at thetorchguys.com. Very important that you go to this. I'm not kidding you at all. This is a product you see a lot of people market these things, but when you're sitting in front of it, I mean, this thing's the real deal.
Yeah,
you fire it up, it takes 2 seconds. You get the propane tank down there, you turn the key, you light it. Here you go. You're going to have a great evening.
Wonderful. Just remember, 15% off, Ruthless promo code, thetorchguys.com.
So we're really excited about this next interview. This is someone we've admired for a long time. He's obviously done great work that speaks for itself. Chris Landau, former U.S. ambassador to Mexico under the President Trump administration. But the rest of your resume, it reads like it's almost fake. It's so good.
I hope you guys didn't get it off Wikipedia because it might be fake in that case.
I mean, the clerkships alone, right? You got Scalia and Thomas in that situation.
I was very blessed. So I went
it's
to
like
law
half
school.
the Mount Rushmore of the.
It was an amazing, for a young lawyer to work for those two, real titans of American jurisprudence at the outset of your career. In a sense, after that, it's like all downhill.
I was just gonna say.
It's a little bit rough.
You've seen it all at a very young age, and then all of a sudden you're like, okay, well,
it doesn't get better than that. And it's. I think it's important for young people to have role models, in life, in terms of intellect and character, just to work for somebody that you say, not that guy's a jerk. Like, I want to be like that guy. Like, I think so much of who we are is because we see people that we want to be, and we make ourselves better by emulating them.
And particularly in a professional setting, right? I mean, you obviously get a whole bunch of this from how you're raised and your parents and everything else, but when you enter the workforce at a relatively young age, I've always found that those first few bosses are sort of formative in what you become.
For good or for ill. I mean, I remember my very first boss out of college was kind of a psycho. I mean, he enjoyed, he was a screamer. He was the kind of guy who I think propped himself up by putting other people down. So again, you learn a lot, like, okay, that's a huge red flag, right?
That seems problematic.
Yes, that seems problematic, right? Like, it doesn't have to be that way. And it is nice, again, I consider it a real blessing to have had that opportunity early on to work for these kind of folks who are not only great human beings and with amazing character and values, but very deep thinkers who have really understand the Constitution, the role of the judiciary.
They care deeply about it.
And they care deeply.
Yeah.
And, it's one of the things that drove me kind of ironically to want to go into foreign policy, because I feel like the Scalias and Thomases starting in the 80s kind of, and with the Federalist Society, kind of had a vision to reform American law and to bring it back to its traditional roots, where you actually read the statute.
Yeah.
You read the Constitution. It is something. I mean, it's like
apply the law.
I mean, there's literally cases that say, like, well, the justices used to go right to policy arguments, like as if they were the political branches. There was kind of an amnesia in the courts during the whole Warren Court era, and even during the Burger Court, and Scalia in particular, brought it back to let's just careful textual analysis in the Constitution. We had analyzed the text, we analyzed the history. My thought is that we haven't had people in our foreign policy arena who kind of want to go back to first principles on foreign policy. I mean, I feel like we have been drifting in foreign policy ever since the end of the Cold War. I mean, during World War II and the Cold War, we kind of knew what the objective was. Right? We might disagree somewhat, but it wasn't that partisan about how to get to the objective. But we knew who the enemy was and what we were doing. We've been drifting around. I mean, it's incredible to me that in the 90s, after the Soviet Union fell, we never had a conversation nationally about, okay, what is the role of NATO now that we no longer have a Soviet Union, right? It was created specifically to counter the Soviet Union, right? And why do we have bases in Germany and Japan? Like, there's perfectly good arguments that we should, and I'm not saying that those arguments are wrong by any means, but it's just weird to me.
Worth a discussion.
It's worth a discussion. You would think, right? But I think now in this whole Ukraine thing, we're paying the price for never having had these discussions about NATO, right? About NATO. Is it wise to expand NATO eastward? And, again, people should be able to discuss that. The American people have not had part of that conversation. They've been ignored by kind of our foreign policy elites have become, I think, in my view, super insular. And they just talk to themselves. And
super good at giving everybody else a pat on the head.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
But if you go back to some of the great eras of our foreign policy, like after the Second World War, you had people like George Marshall, Dean Acheson. These were not people who had grown up in a hothouse foreign policy expert environment. They were, military, lawyers, like people who had a deep understanding of America, right? And so that is lost, though, when you have this kind of castle with the high gates. Like, unless you have been like the deputy assistant secretary, blah, 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 you have no right to opine on these issues.
Well, it becomes like a generational profession passed down from one to the other rather than sort of thinking outside of the box.
It's like a guild where you have the apprenticeship and you have to grow your way up into guild. But that's why I think they've become so detached from the American people.
But you've had a lifetime of exposure to foreign policy issues. I mean, all of the legends you saw while you were growing up, and I mean, you were talking about the sort of like Hall of Fame lineup of the legal career and what those role models meant to you. You had a great role model very early in your life. Your old man left Austria before the Nazis came in.
When the Nazis came in. He was there when Hitler was giving his big speech in Vienna in 1938.
Wild.
I mean, he was there for the Anschluss. He grew up in a Jewish family in Austria. Interestingly, I didn't even know this until I was in college.
Is that right?
No, I did. I mean, I knew he was an immigrant from Austria, but
the circumstances.
So he was 18 years old, and he said, I'm getting out of here. He could see the writing on the wall. And he had some incidents where, like, they forced him to get on his hands and knees and scrub the streets. I mean, it was like, I mean, he saw that firsthand. He didn't talk about that because he came from a stiff upper lip generation, right? People didn't, like, wear victimhood as a badge of pride and honor as they do now. Like, these were not things.
He wasn't posting a TikTok video.
He wasn't posting, I mean, right, and like how much of a victim he is, right? And so I think a lot of who I am is the result of being a first-generation American. So my dad could not get to the United States at that point because we had very restrictive immigration policies under FDR, who my dad actually, very much admired. But I mean, it's just the fact of life that he was very. So he had some family connection in Colombia, South America, and at 18 went by himself without speaking a word of Spanish on a boat to Colombia. But knew his goal was to get to the United States.
Gutsy.
I mean, like, it's incredible. I mean, and again, what amazes me, given our current culture, is that this was not something he ever talked about. I mean, this is something really, some of it I've even learned posthumously.
Interesting.
He passed away at 98 a few years ago. But, he had the fervor, the love of the United States. He ultimately got a job with the Otis Elevator Company in Columbia, and they transferred him to the New York office in July of 1941. So he had worked there for about, less than 6 months when Pearl Harbor happened.
They're like, hey, do you want to transfer to the United States? You're like, sure.
This was actually an incredible
my lifetime goal.
Right,
But, sure.
But this was So yes, he did take that happily. But then they told him after Pearl Harbor, well, I'm sorry, we're going to have to let you go because you're an enemy alien. He still had an Austrian passport, which is a German passport by then, right? And he said, look, this is really unfair.
There's a reason I'm not there.
There's a reason I'm not there. But he came down to the Justice Department on a train on Christmas Eve, 1941, and walked over with a letter to the Attorney General, got into the Justice Department on Christmas Eve. I mean, this just shows how times have changed. And somebody gave him a letter to his employer saying, like, no, he should not be fired as an enemy alien.
Come on.
I have the letter.
I
have the letter.
Wild.
I mean, it's like, but this is our country, our government used to be accessible to the citizens. Somebody could could you imagine now? You'd be like, years of lost files, and I mean, the IRS hasn't even closed his tax return from when he died 6 years ago. I mean, it's like it's still, But anyway, so his immigrant background, he's one of the immigrants, that like came here because he really loved this country, he believed in this country. He then joined the Foreign Service because he wanted to represent this country, and
which I imagine had been sort of formative in your early development.
So I was born in Spain. Because he was serving in the U.S. Embassy in Spain at that point in the early 60s. And then we came back, lived in Canada for a year, D.C. for about 6 years in the State Department. And then we went to Paraguay when I was 8 years old. And so for the next 13 years...
Well, it made it real tough on you to try to find a friend or two, huh?
It's like, it's like a military... I mean, like some of these kind of nomadic upbringings. Yeah. I was lucky that we lived in Paraguay for 5 years. So I went to the same school for 5 years. Okay. And then he was ambassador to Paraguay, Chile, and Venezuela, starting with Nixon through Ford, Carter, and Reagan, because he was a career guy. He wasn't, and actually, he took a lot of pride in being very quiet about his politics. I mean, it's something, again, it's kind of a vestige of a bygone world, right? Like, I didn't know who he voted for in presidential elections until after he retired.
That's amazing.
It just was something where he didn't think it was appropriate to broadcast.
Yeah, now you have a State Department full of people who are writing letters to Biden saying, no, we need to...
Back Hamas.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, it's a far cry.
It was shocking to me. So, I kind of grew up a McCoy and then became a Hatfield because I grew up in a career Foreign Service family where political ambassadors are kind of anathema and but then my dad actually encouraged me not to join the Foreign Service. I was ready to sign up. I mean, I love living abroad. I love foreign policy, international relations. He said, listen, go to law school, get a professional degree, and you'll never be a hostage of the bureaucracy, right?
Great advice.
I think it was great advice. And I can't tell you the number of times my wife and I looked at each other when we were in Mexico and said, like, okay, that was the best advice you ever got in your life. Because if anything, over the ensuing 40 years, it became so much more bureaucratic. And, there's a lot of pathologies in our professional Foreign Service now. And it's very sad to me because I feel like I owe my station in life to the Foreign Service. I mean, it's kind of what made my family and gave us, a middle-class existence in the United States.
But look, I mean, you're giving back. The fact of the matter is you were appointed ambassador to Mexico at a time, obviously coming out of the 2016 election, where there was like a couple of things you could associate with what Donald Trump wanted to do. Our policy regarding Mexico being foremost amongst them, right, with immigration and everything else. So you're obviously in the center of all of this.
And that's why I wanted the job, because I think there are few international relations, probably, if any, that directly affect U.S. prosperity and security as much as the relationship with Mexico. And I mean directly. I mean, and you guys know what I'm talking about. I mean, everybody in America now knows what I'm talking about. I mean,
for better or worse.
Drugs, migration, for better or for worse. And, frankly, on the upside, when I talk about prosperity, Mexico is our largest trading partner. A lot of people don't know that, but we have a huge commercial relationship with Mexico. And so it's just an incredibly important relationship. One of the problems, I think, is that our foreign policy establishment is so focused on Europe and the Middle East. I mean, Mexico has more people than, Germany, France put together. I mean, but if you talk about, the president and the secretary of state have gone off to consult with allies, they're always going to Europe, right? Does anybody ever think they're immediately headed to Mexico City when they hear that? No, it's pretty important that we realize that we just have to think about the world in a different way. So I felt very honored and blessed that Trump gave me the opportunity to kind of shift gears from the legal career where I had been for 30 years back to kind of where my true original passion was. And I really do feel like we need some new blood in that foreign policy area, particularly because Trump had a very different foreign policy paradigm than kind of previous Republican administrations. Any Republican with foreign policy experience in 2016 had pretty much gotten it during the W administration, which turned out to be more Wilsonian than the Wilson administration in terms of international intervention. And again, we can talk about that, but we still see these schisms in the Republican Party today.
Oh,
but
sure. Yeah.
I thought it was really important to have people who are questioning a lot of the assumptions. I mean, as a lawyer, part of my job is to be skeptical and to ask questions, say, well, we've been doing it this way for 50 years and it hasn't worked. Can we maybe think of some other alternatives?
I think that's so important. That perspective is so important to bring, especially to something as big and complicated and wrong-headed sometimes as our own government. And if nobody's questioning the assumptions, then you continue down the wrong path. And I'm sure that you saw a lot of that. When you were ambassador to Mexico, I'm sure when you came in, you saw problems that were created.
I can't imagine there was a whole bureaucracy like, hey, Chris, I just want you to help you do your job.
Right.
And you know what's crazy? So, the mission in Mexico, our embassy in Mexico, it's not only the embassy in Mexico City, we have 9 consulates general, 5 along the border. It's our largest one in the world, okay? I asked for a political chief of staff. I said, look, I need somebody who's kind of, my political person.
Because you knew you had a remit here.
Again, you want to have somebody who is like really making sure that your agenda, the president's agenda, is getting done, who has a different incentive structure than a career person would. They wouldn't give one to me. Like this, which, again, I now realize that was a rookie mistake of mine. Like sometimes you can't take no for an answer. I should have been like, are you kidding me? Like, I'm going to Mexico, as you said before. Like, this is the centerpiece of the president's foreign policy program to get this right. But they wouldn't. So, I get down to Mexico, and then suddenly I'm the only political person in a sea of career people. So even though I am the boss, in a sense, like if you drop a political appointee into a sea of careers, who's really running the show, right? I mean, it's not so easy unless you come in with a very defined sense of what the president's agenda is and how you're going to implement that. Like, it's very easy to immediately get diverted into the career agenda. Let me give you guys an example. Drugs, okay? For the last, 60 years, we've been having a war on drugs. Well, most of our drugs come in from Mexico, right? So obviously Mexico is a huge component of that. Basically, the DEA has been running that for the last 60 years, okay? And I respect the men and women of the DEA, but they're part of the Justice Department, and they define success as how many people can we get Mexico to catch and extradite to us so we can bring them to justice. It's kind of like an Elliott Ness model, right? Like that's how they, going back to incentive structures, that's how they define success in that bureaucracy.
Yeah, it's like back to the Pablo Escobar days, right?
Correct.
That's like the whole vision of
or
how
El
you
Chapo,
handle.
right? Like that's, they can like say like we were super successful, but if you just detaining the high value target doesn't mean like the organizations crumble, right? I mean, I think a lot of times even using the word cartel is one I don't like because to me it suggests an overly structured organization. I mean, these are, there is some structure, but they're also somewhat flexible and loose with lots of offshoots. And, you cut the head off the snake, now the snake has 5 heads, right?
Yeah.
So I don't want the Pablo Escobars or the El Chapos of the world to sleep well, but I'll tell you, 95% of our drug cooperation with Mexico is devoted to the DEA's imperative of begging Mexico to catch the bad guys, because obviously it's in their country, right?
Yeah, right.
So we can't do it, right? So we have kind of outsourced the success of our counter-narcotic strategy to Mexico, which is a profoundly dysfunctional country in many ways. And so, like, it was very clear to me that we were not going to be successful by trying to outsource, our drug policy. And the same thing with migration. Like, we have to, it's my job, my lane in Mexico was to get the Mexicans to be cooperative. I understood that, but it was
What's funny about that is you had success. I think everyone who would understand what it is that President Trump had sort of tasked you with working on would say, well, this is going to inherently be a very confrontational relationship. But it wasn't that.
No, not at all. And I think this was fascinating to me and to a lot of people, that López Obrador is a leftist, but he's also an outsider, right? He did not come from one of the two traditional big parties in Mexico, right? So in a sense, he was kind of like the Trump of Mexico, except that instead of taking over one of the traditional parties, he just founded a third party. And then the traditional parties kind of collapsed, right? And there was so much corruption, and the two parties weren't responsive to the needs of the people. So he and Trump always had a certain understanding of being outsiders who were fighting a very hostile bureaucracy. It's fascinating. Like, even though López Obrador is a leftist, right, we can't just take our right-left models and apply them to other countries.
That doesn't work.
He was slashing the federal government in Mexico in ways that Reagan would have never dreamed of. And he was slashing some departments by 60, 80%. He's super fiscally conservative.
You're like, is this guy a leftist?
Right.
What's
But
going
it's like,
on
right.
here?
But it's like, he's a leftist on some issues. Like, he believes the state should have control over energy, for instance.
Yeah, economic
over some of those
components.
economic issues, right? So again, and he, in terms of social programs, he just wants to give block grant or give money to the poor people directly. He has some. He certainly is a leftist. He'd be the first to say that, but he's not a conventional leftist.
But what
in the sense
look,
that we
obviously you took the time to figure all that out, as one does as an ambassador. But also, look, I can't imagine it was easy to have a productive discussion as it relates to illegal immigration, but you did.
Yes. No, look, I think diplomacy consists of saying, look, here's what I want. I don't have a lot of secrets. I didn't come there with a hidden agenda. We have this huge intelligence bureaucracy. I don't need that, because I did not get one useful bit of information from our intelligence community.
Oh,
the
interesting.
entire time
Really?
I was not one thing. In fact,
That's surprising.
I actually it's surprising and sad and worrisome, right?
Yeah.
Like, again, I think as Republicans who kind of grew up in the Reagan era, we kind of
Yep. I know exactly what you're saying without saying it.
supported,
Yeah. Revere, right.
intelligence,
Right.
military, but those are also big bureaucracies, and we have to be as skeptical of them as any other bureaucracies. They have their own bureaucratic agendas, and we
Yeah.
shouldn't get this wrong. And I would sometimes read reports on Mexico that would come out of these agencies that I disagreed with vehemently. And then I would find out, this was a real shocker to me, that the president had already seen that report. Like, the CIA can report directly to the president.
Yeah, nobody ran it past the ambassador who's sitting in the middle of it.
His own ambassador, right? Like, I'm not saying that my view is the only one that he should get, but it certainly it shouldn't be something that I'm directly opposed to. Right?
There's a reason you're there.
Right, I'm his person, right? But the system is so screwed up that the CIA, the daily briefing, doesn't. I kind of thought that's what the NSC did, is that they would kind of take all the different things, but the CIA briefing goes straight to the president. And so, again, look, I'm not. There's very fine men and women who work for these organizations, but I just think our government has gotten so big and out of control, and there is no accountability for results over the years. Look at what happened in Afghanistan. Like, was one person fired for that? And I can just see, the bureaucracy, they would set up, we're going to have a high-level dialogue on drug or weapons, that come from the United States and Mexico. And I'd get talking points from my staff. And I said, where did these talking points come from? Well, those are the ones we prepared for the last ambassador and the ambassador before that. Literally, I traced these things back to 2009. Okay, so they had been the same talking points. I said, look, I'm not going to do that. I'm not there for performative art, right?
Yeah.
I'm not just going to,
Right.
if we don't have results, I'm not going to do this, right? I'm not going to just
Well, you
show up.
probably feel like you're banging your head against the wall.
You are, but there's no the incentive structure for the bureaucracy, there's no reward for thinking creatively, right? They don't get paid more. Again, the incentive structures are so perverse. A lot of the people in our posts abroad, their job is to spend money. They're said like, this is your program. You must disperse these funds. And they're sometimes begging institutions in other countries to take our money.
That's wild.
One of the most depressing days I had as ambassador was when I reviewed our budgets for these, aid programs we have. First of all, I was like, why do we even have aid in Mexico? Like, I kind of thought aid is when you're helping, countries build latrines, like Mexico is a middle-income country, a member of the OECD, our largest trading partner. Like, it was mostly for kind of, gender violence prevention programs that are very worthy programs. But why is the U.S. taxpayer footing the bill for that in Mexico?
And if you're going to do it, you certainly have to use it as leverage to a broader person.
But that's the point. That is exactly the point. I mean, I tried to think about every question that came up, like, how is this going to advance the security and prosperity of the United States of America, right? And to me, we're not asking that question. Like, we're just kind of, we're on autopilot, right? We're just kind of, the programs are continuing and the money is being spent. Nobody is asking questions. It's kind of like, we're going on fumes.
Do you think another Trump administration, let's say that he's elected in November and he starts in January, do you think that how much, I'm sure that they have created more problems than we even know about since the Biden regime came in. But do you think that it can get back on track? And what are some things that you would anticipate or that you would suggest should be done right away when Trump takes off?
Look, I think day one, we got to get control of the border again. I mean, I think ask any American
and do
like, what is the most pressing, national security threat to the country? Like, how can anybody not answer our own border, right? I mean, like, that is not under control right now, right? And so I actually don't think stopping the migrant flows is going to be that difficult, in the sense that people come. I mean, these are desperately poor people from all around the world. Again, it's not primarily a Mexican phenomenon anymore, which actually opens lots of.
It's an access point.
It's an access point, but it opens
terrifying.
But it is terrifying. But it opens opportunities for cooperation with Mexico that they are no longer the migrant sending country. I mean, there still are, but most of the migrants. This is a very recent phenomenon that the majority of the migrants coming over our southern border of Mexico are not Mexican, right?
Yeah.
That means that Mexicans now have an interest in not being a doormat.
Yeah, I bet they're not wild about it.
They're not wild about it, right? So, like, I thought part of my job as ambassador was to kind of reframe the debate, because traditionally in Mexico, there's a lot of sympathy for migrants, because a lot of those were Mexican traditionally, right? And now I think you have to say, guys, we're in a different world, right? Like, your own, you have to control your own sovereignty of your country too, from being overrun.
You're not the world's hostile,
right? Exactly, and you shouldn't want to be. You have your own problems, and so we have a lot of common interests now with Mexico. So I think with a couple of policy changes that make clear the asylum loophole is closed. I mean, we did that with Remain in Mexico. I think you could do it.
The Remain in Mexico thing was just brilliant.
It was a game changer.
Yeah, game changer.
Because I mean, it underscored immediately how this was all a scam, right? Like that people were basically just using the legal tools. And what was sad is that when you wind up having hundreds of thousands of people have bogus claims for asylum, the ones who actually, the 100 people who might actually have real asylum claims get lost in the system, because it just becomes a big bureaucratic system at that point. So I think, to go back to your question, I think day one, we got to take action on the border. I don't think that, I think people are going to realize the gig is up if Trump wins, and they're not going to spend their money, right? And I think, the big challenge then is going to be the domestic challenge of how do you undo, the 10 or 12 million people. I mean, if you think about it, the illegal population that's come in under Biden is larger than the population, I think, of 44 of our 50 states.
That's wild.
But I mean, like, how do you undo that? And if you don't undo it quickly, it gets much harder, because then people have children, they settle down, they become members of the community. I mean, you can't have a system where one party follows the law and the other party doesn't, and then it's a one-way ratchet then, right?
Totally.
So that's
and the
a big
domestic
challenge.
politics of that have been tricky forever.
Yeah,
right?
but
I mean,
but they shouldn't be in the sense that shouldn't we all as Americans, we can have a discussion about what the appropriate level of legal migration should be, right? And when they say like there's certain jobs Americans won't take, we can have guest worker programs. I don't see how anybody in good faith can be in favor of illegal migration, right?
Totally.
By definition, right? I mean, it's one of the things I think the Republicans have done a poor job at is explaining that is super exploitative of these people. I mean, they have to live in the shadows. We have all these gold-plated laws about workplace protection. If you're an illegal immigrant, right, you can't.
You get none of it.
You get none of it, right?
Yeah.
You have to live in the shadows. You don't want to go to the emergency room. You don't want to go. Your employers.
It's a lie. The whole like sales pitch that these. I can't. Do they call them wolves now, or do they call it the
Coyotes?
Yeah, the coyote. It's such a lie that these people are told, and then also it completely misses the difference in the types of people who are coming over. There are some people who are coming over here who want to make a better life, who really see the opportunity of America, want to participate in our society, and there are way, way too many people, an increasing number of people who are quite frankly like 18 to 23-year-old men who are of fighting age, who are not interested in taking out an application at Home Depot or something to try to like build a new life. They want to cause problems.
Right.
And if that is terrifying to so many people, and I think that over the last 4 years of the Biden administration, more and more people who are concerned about the overarching trends of illegal immigration have watched this in horror and watched what happened in Israel on October 7th in horror, because they know that there's some day that they could find themselves sleeping in on a Saturday morning, and then all of a sudden there's an outbreak of violence that they never expected.
Yes. And I feel it was part of my job, again, as a first-generation American, the son of immigrants myself. I feel like I'm not racked by guilt in saying this, right? It's one of the essential attributes of a sovereign country is to determine who is allowed into that country and the circumstances, right? I mean,
it seems like kind of a job one thing.
You would think so, right? Like it just doesn't. I mean, but this didn't used to be a big political football in the sense of like Democrats were voting for border walls as recently as this century, right? Like I mean, it was not that long ago.
Yeah, I think it was 07, 08.
Right, exactly. And so it's just one of the things that is weird to me that has to change. I think the Mexicans understand that. I mean, my understanding now is that Biden is basically bribing the Mexicans with $1 billion a month. Which again, think about how screwed up our political system is.
With no leverage.
Well, yeah, to stop from now until November to basically control the problem, right? And to like send them down, right? But like we could fix this for free by fixing our own policies. Yeah. But they would they want a virtue signal. They want to say like, no, our policies, we got rid of the those xenophobic, hateful Trump policies, right? So instead, they're doing the exact same thing by basically just paying the Mexicans $1 billion to try to do this, right? And
meanwhile, creating barrios all over the United States.
Every country every state is a border state now.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's the same thing they're doing in energy, right? They stopped domestic energy production, and then they're begging Venezuela and Iran to like increase energy production. It's like they want to. They're more interested in virtue signaling. Anyway, like I'm probably going off topic here from Mexico, but
it's most important subject.
You're right.
It really is.
But I hope that it is interesting. Again, I think Biden has somewhat been successful in the sense that in the last few months, the migration headlines have receded, right? And I think that
politically successful.
Politically successful. But that is just because he has basically bribed Mexico to do this. I don't blame the Mexicans. If somebody was offering me the money, like I think I would take it too. Why not? I mean, it's very important for Biden to say this is all about the root causes in other countries, about poverty. Like those root causes have been there forever. This surge had nothing to do with root causes. There wasn't like a fascist regime that took over in Guatemala when Biden took over, right? Or a earthquake or a hurricane.
It was probably the green flag he was waving as he took the oath of office.
Correct.
Right?
I mean, I saw that even I was ambassador until January 20th. And, my wife and I were driving around Mexico City. We could already see streams of migrants in Mexico City. And they're like, we love Biden. Like we kind of,
They knew.
got out of the car, right? They knew. Of
Yeah.
course they knew. Like, there's no secret. Like, again, people are not...
It was like somebody shot a starting gun.
Right. People are not dumb. Like, they're not going to do this if they think that they have no chance of getting in or staying here if they do get in. If they're basically assured, like, yeah, we're going to let you in. You just have to, incant these particular words, and then you're in. And guess what? You stay there. You might have, like, an appointment. The last I heard, they were scheduling some of these asylum appointments for, like, 2034.
I mean,
That's
but
that's
I mean,
fake.
and
That's
by
just
then,
made up.
it's made up. And, like, people don't show up for that. So,
you got another generation behind them at that point.
of course
right?
you do. And, and by then, of course, then they can claim, well, I've had children here.
Yeah.
I've had this job. And listen, I don't blame the migrants. I mean, these folks want to, by and large, a lot of these folks, and there's obviously exceptions, but they want to come here for the same reasons that our ancestors. I mean, we are a country of immigrants. But to me, that the question again should not be immigrant, non-immigrant. It should be legal, illegal. And then the political discussion in this country should be, what is the appropriate level of legal migration? And particularly, how does that relate to work programs? Like, there are these H-2A visas where people come in. A lot of these, like, Mexican agricultural workers, they don't want to immigrate here, right? They don't want, they're happy in their pueblo. They want to make the money that they can make here and go back. And that's what we had. Like, in the 40s and 50s, we had the Bracero program, which was very successful in meeting American labor needs. But interestingly, like Cesar Chavez and a lot of the American, agricultural workers were the ones who wanted to stop those programs because it was competition to lower the wages. Fine. I mean, again, the American workers.
It's another argument.
That's
why
fair.
you have sane policy that's enforceable, so you can actually be responsive.
But now,
in a
if
democracy.
nobody here wants to, let's say, pick the strawberries, okay, well then we should try to have programs that make it easy. That if an employer needs somebody to, like, pluck their turkeys at Thanksgiving time, if they need 200 workers and they can't find local workers willing to do that, okay, but those programs are so cumbersome now with State Department, Labor Department, DHS, like. You have to do it like 2 years in advance. Well, who knows what their needs are going to be? What business can always plan for that? So what I think we need to do is not only be talking about, the kind of negative side, the like stop people, but we also need to talk about what are our needs for labor from abroad and how do we best address those needs? Again, in our interest. Again, how do we promote the prosperity and security of the United States? And we should have an immigration program that is geared towards those objectives. We can differ as Americans about that. We can talk about, well, maybe, people, maybe they should raise the price of this so that people will actually do it. Maybe we have to talk about, the welfare state is paying people enough so that it actually is not rational for them to get up off their couch and go pick strawberries, right? I mean, like, again, but
it's all interconnected at some level, right?
But these are domestic political conversations, but I don't see how the conversation should ever be, yes, I think illegal migration is the way to go. One of the most moving experiences I had in my life was when I went to an event at the Mexican Cultural Institute here a couple years ago. There's an angel visa program that brings aged parents of people who came illegally to this country like 40 or 50 years ago. They're now in their 70s or 80s. And they haven't seen their children. Because if you're here illegally, it's not like you can just go home for Christmas. It's not like you can go home for your mother's funeral or your wife's birthday, right? So if you're here illegally, you're basically stuck here. Talk about family separation, right? So these, Mexican, farm workers would be flown up from Mexico. They flew up from Mexico. They hobble across the streets, and they see their children they haven't seen in 40 years. And you say, how can people say that this is a good system, right? Like, how can people say, and how can people say this is the morally superior system? How can the people who say I am the morally virtuous
nothing compassionate about it.
Nothing compassionate about it. But we have lost that narrative, right? We have allowed the people who want to just enforce the law.
Somehow that is a lack of compassion.
We're the mean people, right?
But creating abject poverty and putting people through hell and gone,
right? Just
by virtue of their existence is somehow the virtuous
thing to do.
Yeah,
but again, I think that is a communications problem on our part to talk about these issues. And again, I think Mexico is perfectly willing to go along with this. I mean, I was in Mexico City last month. And it was kind of weird because I think a lot of people there think Trump's going to win. So all of a sudden, like, I was like a rock star.
People were like a lot more attention.
People were like calling me, can we meet? Can we talk? And I said, listen, I'm a private citizen. I'm not affiliated with the campaign, so I'm speaking for myself. But I just wanted to hear what they had to say. And I think they know this is not healthy, right? I mean, anybody can look at it and say, there cannot be a healthy U.S.-Mexico relationship if the border is in disarray. Right? That is not good. And the Mexicans care a lot about particularly the commercial stuff, right? I mean, you don't want to have a situation where the trucks that are transporting the vegetables have to wait 12 hours in the sun and let it possibly, because all the border patrol people, all the, you know, the CBP people at the border are busy like being social workers taking care of migrants. I mean, it's kind of a zero-sum game.
Oh, it's just cascading effects. I got to ask you a couple questions here before we get you out of here. My first, before we get to our final three questions, do you have any ambition to go back and do some form of something within the government again?
100%. I actually would love to go back to Mexico, and this is probably presumptuous of me to say, but I don't feel like I finished my job there. I mean, I'd been there 7 months when the pandemic started, right? So after that, it was basically treading water. So I had kind of identified.
I'm glad to hear that.
All the pathologies, but, you know, again, I think we need people who can hit the ground running on day one and kind of know exactly what the objective is and how to accomplish that. So I mean you never know. I mean that's pretty rare, but I would love to do that. It was a great honor to be in government service again. It was for me kind of a tribute to my father too. He was an ambassador, and you know, like again, I feel like this country gave him so much. I love the you know, being able to
I love
contribute.
That. That's fantastic.
It's a great honor to represent your country abroad. It's almost indescribable.
No question about it. All right, so here are our final three questions.
Okay.
You know what's coming.
I know what's coming. I'm a listener of your show, let me tell you, religious.
I love it. It's a family tradition.
It is. Oh, and let me say this. I have to give a shout out. My son, who's a big listener of your show and who I gain huge props for being invited on your show.
What's your son's name?
Nat.
Okay.
Yeah. So he graduated this past weekend from great Notre Dame University.
Oh, he did. He's a domer.
Indiana. He's a domer. And so I know you guys were just in Indiana.
Yeah.
I was in Indiana this weekend for his graduation, so super proud of him.
I bet.
You know, I'm blessed, and he's blessed. He has a job coming out of college, which is not self-evident these days. And anyway, so big shout out to Nat. Nat, Dad is very proud of you.
I'm not worried about the ambition in the Landau.
I
feel pretty good about that.
I think ambition must be genetic, because in my family, I was like the world's most ambitious, like 16-year-old. Like, believe me.
Well, seeing your dad's resume, I kind of get it, Chris. I kind of get it.
Yeah.
All right. So, if you could plan your last meal on Earth, what would it be?
I think the brain is the most sensory organ. And so I would do something that would put my head in a place that would take me back to a very happy part of my life. And so I would pick the peach cobbler that my now wife, then girlfriend, made me the first couple of months when we started dating. I didn't understand at that point how critical the stomach was as a route to the heart. And anyway, I just remember I had never had anybody kind of make these foods. She made, actually, honey, please make that peach cobbler. It's been, you know, I know we've been married for 26 years now, but like, you know, I fell in love with my wife. The peach cobbler was very much a part of that whole montage where we fell in love. And I would like to have my last moments on Earth be remembering those moments of my life, along with the contrasting texture of the sweetness of the peaches with the lemon she puts in and the softness of the peaches.
This is really left it in
with the crumble.
Yeah, really is.
So I tell you, I'm a listener of your show, so believe me, I've had time to think about this.
Yes.
I'm not picking something off the top of my head.
No, that was well thought through.
You know, listen, that's this should be a little bonus for your frequent listeners.
It's a huge bonus because not only was it well thought through, the presentation was exquisite.
Thank you. Okay, well,
The
listen.
description made it.
Well, when you learn at the knee of Scalia.
Guys, right. I suspect, frankly, that there's probably not a single listener to your show who isn't in their own head thinking, what would I answer those questions? I know I've been for a long time. I've discussed this with my wife, you know, who she actually suggested this. And I thought, you are darn right. Like, I think that's right.
I love that.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So the second question is, obviously you've had an incredibly successful career, both in the law and former ambassador. You've got time to kind of look back and see where your life has brought you. Learned and gained a lot of experiences along the way. If you could look back and just take kind of 20 years with blue sky, where you could go back and do it all over again, what would you do?
I would want to be a film director.
Yes.
I think
these are the kind.
Yeah.
You are a great listener of this program. That's the kind of answer I'm looking for, right?
Yeah,
Something
but
totally outside of the
Yeah.
box.
Again, I think film is such a powerful medium. It combines writing, it combines visuals, it combines music, and it can be so powerful. It gives people. I think a lot of us remember a scene from a movie that was really overwhelming. It can be. To me, it is such a beautiful medium. I mean, it's more powerful than just being a writer or a painter or a composer. It puts the whole package together. And I think, frankly, it is sad to me as an American that our cultural arbiters, the people who are directing movies in Hollywood, constantly produce stuff that drags us down as a country. Like constantly, I understand, like, okay, the anti-hero was kind of cool in the late 60s when that was coming in, like Easy Rider and all that stuff. Like, okay, but that's so old already. Like, people want in their lives to be uplifted. They want role models. I mean, I'm blessed to have had role models. Why do we as a nation have a culture that just always insists on focusing on the negative, right? I mean, like, we have an incredible country, right? Like, that doesn't mean we should ignore the, there's some blots on our history too. Of course, we're all human beings, right? Yeah. We're children of God. We're fallen people, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't celebrate what makes us great and what makes the human spirit great. And I just feel like so much of our culture has become a downer that is sending terrible messages. Mm-hmm. I just think there's a huge desire for that. And I feel
what a
like
great answer. Yeah. That's awesome.
Film could really uplift people.
That's so good. I love it. All right, so the third question. I don't need to explain it. Are you a thrill or an agony guy?
I am 1,000% an agony guy. Okay, like that is for me not even the close question. I mean, I actually have a hard time even kind of wrap my head around, like, how does a thrill guy work? I mean, like, I mean, it sounds great. I love the idea. But, like, I mean, I'm a lawyer, so, you win some, you lose some. I mean, pretty much you always get a W or an L. And let me tell you, the W's, I kind of don't even remember. The L's, boy, do they sting. I mean, it is. But, like, I don't know. Like, to me, that's almost like it's part and parcel of being like a type A person. At least for me. Like, I respect. I mean, I know you've had some guests who are. It's
an interesting split.
Thrill of victory. I mean, to me, and it's kind of sad in a way. Like, the downside of failure is so much worse or so much more motivating than the upside of success. And that doesn't seem right. Like, I don't.
Plus, it's like a hitchhiker in your brain for the rest of your life,
yes.
right? I mean, it's just like just a constant memory.
Yes, I mean, as a lawyer, it's tough. It's really tough. I mean, I have definitely, lost some cases that I thought I should win, and those haunt me. I mean, I still remember, like, I had a Supreme Court case once that I thought we were going to win, and I got a call from the clerk's office. No, it went, they reversed or affirmed. I don't remember, but I felt like throwing up. I mean, like, I just like I take everything really. Like, it becomes part of me. Like, I'm not just like, kind of going through life, like, dabbling in this and that. I'm very passionate about what I do. You probably could tell that from the interview. And, like, I don't like to lose. I'm very competitive. And anyway, so I'm definitely not going to defeat.
I love it. Listen, Ambassador Chris Landau, I can't thank you enough for coming in here. Like I said, we've been admirers of your work. You even brought us something.
I did. I brought you some tribute, right? I mean, I think, this is like the way that peoples have always expressed throughout human history, their respect by bringing tribute when they come into another household diplomatically. It's actually kind of interesting. So this is a bottle of mezcal, artisanal mezcal from Oaxaca, Mexico. Obviously super trendy nowadays. I really respect spirits culture. Like, there's a big spirits culture in Mexico with tequila. I mean, this goes back to pre-Hispanic times. I mean, I saw the agave being crushed and the process for doing this.
Pretty cool.
But anyway, it's super cool. The sad thing is, for me, I don't even drink. Okay, so like, as an ambassador, that is not easy. My dad didn't drink either, so he'd kind of have ginger. I mean, I would toast and everything like that, but like people,
I'll tell you how it goes.
Yeah, please tell me how it goes, please. You guys enjoy this. It ain't bourbon, but I figured, like, former ambassador to Mexico, like, I had to do kind of, this is my lane. So, like, this is the mezcal, and drink it in good health, you guys. God bless you for what you do. As I said, I've been a huge fan of the show. I've been so excited to come on here. Again, it gives me huge props as a dad. My son is going to love listening to this, and I love being part of this kind of friends conversation that I've been listening in on now for,
well, you're welcome anytime.
Thank
Our
you.
very best to Nat and the entire family.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Take care.
On a serious note, we like to spend some time around Memorial Day weekend thinking about the heroes of this country, and it gets way too little talk around this, particularly now. I feel like when I was growing up, this was a real day of reverence, and people were, took time out of their day to actually think about what their fathers, grandfathers, people had done for this country to make sure that we had the freedoms that we did and the capabilities that we have, whereas the rest of the world, sort of didn't look like us. And I know it's always meant a lot to me. My grandfather was a World War II veteran, and like a lot of them, didn't talk a lot about it.
Yeah.
But I know you fellas have some thoughts on this too.
Yeah, I mean, my grandfather didn't talk about it because he fought in World War II as well. He didn't talk about it until I was in high school, and I was doing a project for my history class, and it was this thing called the Legacy Initiative. It's actually like a organization where they do oral histories of veterans, and so I interviewed my grandfather for that. And
Was it like the first time you were hearing any of this?
It wasn't just the first time I had ever heard it. It was the first time he ever talked about it.
Wow.
My dad didn't ever hear any of this
Wow.
stuff. He never talked about it at all. And the thing that always stuck with me from that interview about the not talking about it was when he came home, he was like, people want to talk about the baseball game.
Yeah.
Like nobody wanted to hear about that stuff.
They don't want to hear
And
about
that whole generation just sort of like locked it down, buried it, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, he was 19 years old when he was drafted. He was putting rivets on airplanes at Hudson Motor Company in Detroit, Michigan. 19 years old, gets drafted. And, gets shipped off. It was just after the invasion of France, after D-Day.
Normandy, yeah.
Yeah. And fought in the Battle of the Bulge. After he was in the Lightning Division, the 78th Infantry. And after the Battle of the Bulge, basically it was a race to get to Germany.
Yeah.
And the Germans, as they were making this retreat, were trying to blow all the bridges, right? Like they're trying to mess up Allied supply lines. And their famous battle was after Battle of the Bulge, which obviously was a huge turning point in the war, was holding the Remagen Bridge. The Remagen Bridge became the main thoroughfare for all of the Allied supplies into Germany proper. And the 78th, the Lightning Division, had to basically keep that bridge from being blown up.
Yeah.
And, they cross the bridge, and then you're going town to town, all the way to Berlin. And the guy got hit by shrapnel as they were approaching one town. A huge piece of shrapnel in his ass, of all places.
Yeah, right.
Gets sent back to Paris. And
He didn't love talking about that.
He's there for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And they're like, all right, back to the front.
It's amazing, right?
And he told me such incredible stories. But, the one thing that also sticks with me is when they finally, got to Berlin. Patton said this too, which was, the Germans were terrible, obviously. But those Soviets were horrible too.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that was one thing that also stuck with me when I interviewed him. And he never talked about it, the whole of his life. And he died a couple years later after that.
Yeah.
That interview I did with him when I was in
What a
in high
blessing
school.
that you were able to do it.
Yeah.
Oh,
and my son, my 4-year-old son, Joseph, is named after him.
Oh, is he really? Okay,
So-
I didn't realize that.
That's fascinating. Johnny, I know you've got some thoughts.
Well, I always think about the guys who are our generation.
Totally.
I think about Wolf and the guys he knew. I think about my cousins and my wife's cousins and the guys they knew. And they're
I had 3 or 4 guys in my fraternity at ASU. Of course, I was that 9/11 when you're in college.
Yeah.
Generation where they're out just kicking the shit out of somebody in front of the fraternity house
Yeah.
one day.
Yeah.
And a year later, all of them are out like doing their country's business.
Yeah, and they gave everything, and so we can sit here and talk politics on a podcast. I mean, it's the greatest sacrifice that I just don't think is appreciated enough.
Yeah.
And I think there's this guy who was from Cincinnati. I usually think about him. This guy named Matt Maupin. He was a prisoner of war for a long time in Iraq.
I remember
very,
the name.
very famous.
In fact, I think we met him at one point.
Well, he didn't make it back. You might be thinking of a different guy.
One of his
It was a guy.
platoon leaders or something. It was somebody that was
with him. Yeah.
With him.
Yeah.
That I think we met at some point because I remember talking in great detail about his story.
Yeah. It was a tragic situation. So like I think about the guys who were our age who just gave so much, and both of my grandfathers were in the Pacific. My grandmother was in Camp Pendleton. She was a Marine. And I think
right?
Yeah, well, I think one of my favorite stories though is actually it's not as serious as the one that Duncan told. My dad's dad, he was an electrician's mate in the Navy.
Yeah.
And so when he was over in the Pacific, they met this guy named Rino Barsacchini, an Italian guy. Okay?
Yeah.
And
It's all right.
Can't be trusted,
He
right?
was on our
Spaghetti.
side. He was on our side.
We're spaghetti. You can't trust him.
Spaghetti.
No, he's telling tall tales.
So Reno tells all the guys, he's like, hey, I know Joe DiMaggio. And everybody's like, okay, sure, Reno. Yeah, I'm sure you're buddies with Joe DiMaggio. Yeah, we believe you. Go on. And then my grandpa said that when he came back to America years later, he opens up the newspaper and there's Joe DiMaggio getting married to Marilyn Monroe, and who's the best man? Rino Barsacchini.
No, get out of here.
Amazing.
That is
So
a
he
great
was like,
story.
I guess he was telling the truth.
That is a great story. Smug, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think one of the critical things to remember is for Memorial Day, it is Memorial Day. It's people who
who
served
didn't
our
make it back.
country and gave everything for it so that we can be here to enjoy a day. And I think a very important part of being able to enjoy that day is recognizing that sacrifice. My ritual for Memorial Day is watching Band of Brothers.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
That's a
Great series,
show.
true story. And you really get an appreciation for the sacrifice and the dedication that these folks have. And it's for all of us, all of our benefit. They literally gave their lives. And, there's no way to express enough gratitude for that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
really well said. Really well said. We wanted to keep it short and sweet for you, and keep it to where our heart is on Memorial Day, which is something I think everybody ought to just take a moment. I understand what you're drinking beers, you're hanging out, you're throwing something on the grill, hanging out with your buddies. You ought to do all of that. Then just take a few minutes,
Yeah,
right? I think we did it.
I think so. Absolute banger of an episode. Gentlemen, thanks to the Torch guys, and thank you to the Minions, and thank you to all who served and all who gave their lives for us. So, until next time, Minions, keep the faith, hold the line, and own the libs. We'll see you on Thursday. Stay ruthless.